I beg you, just make it quick." The rancher froze and did the unthinkable Wild West stories. Each morning, he rose before the sun, the cool air of the Wild West brushing against his face as he stepped onto the porch of his small wooden cabin. The world seemed quiet here, almost untouched, except for the soft sounds of cattle lowing in the distance and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. The land stretched for miles, a patchwork of golden fields, dry creeks and rolling hills, and Elias had learned every inch of it like the lines on his own hands. He liked it that way. Out here there were no distractions, no endless chatter of townsfolk, and no one to tell him how to live his life. He was his own master, and that was enough. His days began with tending the cattle, checking the fences, and making sure the water troughs were filled. It was simple, repetitive work, but it brought a certain satisfaction that he couldn't find anywhere else. Every fence post nailed, every calf counted, every trail mended, these were small victories that made the day feel complete. Despite his love for the land, life had not been kind to Elias in every way. He had grown older now, his hair streaked with gray, his hands calloused and scarred from years of labor. He had lost people he cared about, family he hardly spoke of anymore, friends who had either moved on or passed. These losses weighed on him, but he carried them quietly, never allowing them to disturb the calm routine he had built. There were nights when he would sit on the porch, looking out at the endless horizon, feeling the loneliness press in. Yet he accepted it, knowing that this was the price of freedom and independence. The small town nearby was a place Elias visited only when necessary. People knew him, of course. He was the rancher who kept to himself, who could be relied upon for honesty and a strong hand when needed, but there was a respectful distance. They respected his privacy, and he respected theirs. Rumors sometimes drifted from the town: a robbery down the road, a family feud that had turned violent, a band of outlaws causing trouble in the mountains. Elias listened to these tales with mild concern, but he never let fear dictate his life. He trusted his instincts, and his instincts had always served him well. One morning, as the sun began to rise over the hills, Elias mounted his horse, Rust, a sturdy chestnut with a patient temperament. He rode out across the fields, checking the fences along the eastern pasture. It was a crisp morning, the kind that made the earth smell alive, and he felt a rare sense of peace as the wind brushed past him. He hummed a soft tune, something his mother used to sing, and for a moment it seemed as though nothing could disturb the quiet rhythm of his life. But the Wild West was never truly quiet. As Elias rode along the far edge of his property, he noticed something unusual, a movement near the tree line that bordered his land. At first he thought it was just a deer or maybe a stray dog, but the shape seemed wrong, more deliberate. He urged Rust forward slowly, eyes narrowed. Whoever, or whatever it was moving cautiously, almost like it was aware of him. "Who's out there?" Elias called, his voice firm but calm. The wind carried it across the fields, but there was no reply, only silence. He dismounted and walked closer, the gravel crunching under his boots. He could feel his pulse quicken, not from fear, but from the sudden awareness that the peaceful morning might be interrupted. His hand rested near the holster at his hip, a gesture born of habit more than expectation. Then he saw the figure more clearly. A man, ragged and dirty, stumbled out from behind a clump of trees. His clothes were torn, his face smeared with dirt and sweat, and his eyes held a desperate fear that made Elias pause. The man looked as though he had been running for a long time, and he carried a small bundle pressed tightly to his chest. For a moment, the two men simply stared at each other, the air between them tense, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Elias stepped forward cautiously. "You lost?" he asked, his voice steady. The man shook his head violently, clutching the bundle tighter. No, you don't understand," he gasped. "They're after me. Please, I need your help." Elias studied him carefully. There was a tremor in the man's voice, a raw sincerity, but there was also a flicker of something else. Fear, yes, but maybe something more dangerous. Elias had seen desperate men before. Sometimes they were innocent, sometimes they were trouble waiting to happen. Yet he couldn't just turn away. Not here, not now. He gestured toward the cabin. You can come in, sit, calm down. The man nodded quickly, relief flooding his face. As they walked back, Elias kept his eyes on him, noting every movement, every twitch, every hesitation. He had to know if this man was a threat or simply another soul caught in the harshness of the world. Inside the cabin, Elias offered the man water. He drank it greedily, trembling with exhaustion. Elias watched silently, the room filled with the faint scent of smoke and leather, the quiet ticking of a small clock on the wall. Finally, the man looked up, his eyes wide and haunted. "They'll kill me," he whispered. "If they find me, I'm done for." Elias didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked over to the window, looking out at the vast fields beyond. There was something primal about the land, something that reminded him of the fragility of life and the certainty of consequences. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. To help this man might mean danger, perhaps even death. To refuse might mean letting an innocent, or perhaps guilty, soul be destroyed. The man's pleading voice broke through his thoughts. "I beg you, just make it quick. Please, you have to help me." There was desperation there, raw and unfiltered, and Elias felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had faced many challenges in his life, but this was different. This required more than strength. It required judgment, courage, and an understanding of what it meant to be human in a world that often punished the weak. Elias took a deep breath, the morning light spilling across the wooden floorboards. He thought of the cattle, the fences, the routine life he had built. He thought of the long stretches of lonely nights on the porch, the quiet companionship of the land, the isolation he had come to cherish. And yet, something about this man, his fear, his urgency, his humanity, stirred something in Elias that he had not felt in years: empathy. "All right," Elias said finally, his voice low but firm. "You can stay here for now, but you follow my rules. No sudden moves, no lies. I need to know I can trust you." The man nodded, relief washing over his features, but Elias could see the tension in his body, the way his hands trembled even as he tried to calm himself. Outside, the wind whispered through the grass, carrying a hint of unease. The day that had begun with calm and routine was now shifting, the balance of the ranch, and perhaps the life of its owner, hanging in delicate uncertainty. Elias went about his chores as usual, but nothing felt the same. Every sound, every shadow, every distant cry seemed amplified, as though the world had grown sharper, more dangerous. He checked the fences twice, made sure the cattle were safe, and kept an eye on the stranger. By nightfall, the man had eaten a simple meal and fallen into a restless sleep on a cot in the corner. Elias watched him for a moment, wondering what had led him to this moment, what choices had brought him to the edge of despair, and what dangers might be creeping closer with every passing hour. As darkness settled over the ranch, Elias felt the familiar weight of solitude press in once more. But this time, it was different. There was another life here now, fragile and frightened, and it was up to him to decide what that life would become. The peaceful rhythm of his existence had been broken, replaced by something more uncertain, more intense. The Wild West was full of harsh realities, and Elias McGraw knew, deep down, that the days ahead would test him in ways he could not yet imagine. He stepped onto the porch, the night cool against his skin, and looked out over the land he had always known. The stars glimmered faintly above, and the wind carried a quiet warning. Somewhere out there, danger was moving closer. And somewhere inside him, a decision was forming, one that would change everything. The next morning, the sun rose over the ranch with a golden glow, painting the fields and hills in warm light. Elias McGraw had spent a restless night. Sleep had come in short, uneasy bursts. his mind constantly drifting to the stranger sleeping in the corner of his cabin. He wondered where the man had come from, what kind of trouble had forced him to run through the Wild West alone, and whether his presence would bring danger to the ranch. He shook his head slightly, trying to push the thoughts away. There was work to do, and work always had a way of keeping his mind clear. The stranger had woken early, too, staring at the floor with hollow eyes. He didn't speak much, only whispered apologies when he accidentally knocked over a tin cup or shuffled across the floor. Elias had given him a small breakfast, but the man barely touched it, shaking his head as he whispered about needing to move, to hide, to keep running. Elias watched him quietly, studying every movement, every nervous glance. Something about the man seemed both fragile and desperate. By mid-morning, Elias decided he needed to get outside and start his work. The cattle would not tend themselves, and the fences required attention, especially after the recent winds that had knocked down several posts. He saddled Rust and led the horse toward the eastern pasture. The stranger watched silently from the cabin door, leaning against the frame as though he feared moving further out. "You need to stay inside today," Elias said, his voice firm but calm. "If anyone is following you, you need to be careful. This land is wide, but it's also dangerous if you're not careful." The stranger nodded quickly, swallowing hard. "I understand. I just need a moment to catch my breath." His voice cracked slightly, and Elias realized just how exhausted and terrified this man truly was. The sight made Elias feel a strange mixture of pity and worry. He knew the Wild West could be unforgiving, and anyone out here, alone and afraid, was vulnerable. Elias rode through the fields, checking fences, coaxing cattle away from dangerous areas and mending broken posts. But despite the calm of his usual routine, his mind kept returning to the man. He couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was coming. There was something in the stranger's eyes, something that told him danger was not far behind. And the more Elias thought about it, the more he realized he needed to prepare. By late morning, a faint sound reached his ears, a low, rhythmic thudding that seemed distant at first but slowly grew clearer. Hooves, horses. The sound sent a shiver down Elias' spine. He stopped Rust and scanned the horizon. Sure enough, in the distance, he could see dust rising, small clouds moving quickly across the dry plains. Figures on horseback were approaching, riding with purpose, and Elias immediately knew that they were not friends. He urged Rust into a slow trot, keeping a careful watch. The men were far enough away that he could not make out faces, but he could tell from the speed and coordination of their movement that they were after something or someone. His heart raced, but his mind stayed sharp. He had faced wild animals, harsh storms, and desperate men before, but the thought of armed strangers heading toward his property with unclear intentions was new and unsettling. Back at the cabin, the stranger had noticed the dust clouds as well. Panic flashed across his face, and he turned to Elias with pleading eyes. "They're coming for me," he said, voice shaking. "Please, I didn't do anything wrong. You have to hide me." Elias dismounted, leading Rust toward the stable but keeping one eye on the approaching figures. "Stay calm," he said firmly. "We'll figure this out. You need to follow my instructions exactly." He paused, thinking quickly. He knew the land well, the hidden trails, the dense tree lines, the narrow gullies that could conceal a person. He had used them before to protect livestock from thieves and predators. Now he realized they could serve another purpose. Elias grabbed a heavy coat and a rope, his mind racing through the possibilities. He knew he could not confront the riders directly. They were too many, too fast, and too determined. No, he had to think smarter, not harder. He would lead them away from the cabin, give the stranger a chance to escape, and hope the men chasing him were not as skilled as he hoped. The stranger watched him, trembling. "What do I do?" he asked, voice barely audible. "Where do I hide?" "Inside the cellar," Elias said. "There's an old trapdoor in the back. It's small, but it'll keep you out of sight. Don't make a sound. Do you understand?" "Yes," the man whispered, urgency and fear mingling in his voice. He moved quickly, following Elias's instructions, his body tense with fear. Elias then returned to Rust and started toward the open field, keeping himself in plain sight of the riders but careful not to draw too much attention. He needed to appear calm, confident, and capable. He needed to be convincing enough that they would focus on him, giving the stranger time to hide. As he rode, he studied the riders. There were at least 4 of them, wearing dust-stained hats and carrying rifles slung across their backs. Their faces were set with determination, and their eyes were scanning the horizon for any sign of their target. Elias guided Rust carefully along the ridge, using his knowledge of the terrain to create small obstacles and misdirections. He ducked behind rocks when necessary, slowed down when needed, and even feigned ignorance at times, letting the riders believe they were closing in. The dust rose around him, the sun beating down, and his heart pounded as adrenaline surged through him. Every second mattered. Meanwhile, in the cabin, the stranger crouched in the dark cellar, listening to every sound. He could hear hooves clattering, shouts in the distance, and the occasional bark of a dog. Fear gripped him, but he followed Elias's instructions, remaining silent and motionless. Every breath felt loud in the confined space, every heartbeat echoing off the wooden walls. Hours seemed to pass like this. Elias continued to maneuver carefully, leading the riders on a chase across his land, always keeping the cabin and the hidden stranger out of their direct line of sight. He had to think of every possibility. What if they split up? What if one of them guessed the hiding place? What if the stranger panicked? The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, heavier than any physical labor he had ever done. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Elias managed to guide the riders past a dense copse of trees. Their attention was momentarily drawn away, and he took advantage of the moment to turn back toward the cabin. His mind raced, thinking of the stranger and the precarious position he was in. The man had trusted him with his life, and now Elias had to ensure that trust was not betrayed. As he returned, he noticed signs of struggle nearby, broken branches, trampled grass, footprints in the dirt. It was a stark reminder that the Wild West was unforgiving and that danger could strike anyone at any time. He took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay focused. The stranger was still in the cellar, waiting, and now more than ever he needed to ensure his safety. When Elias arrived back at the cabin, he found the stranger still crouched in the corner of the cellar, pale but alive. Relief washed over both of them, though neither spoke immediately. Words were unnecessary. The moment carried all the weight of what had just passed, the narrow escape, the danger avoided, and the tense anticipation of what might still come. "Good," Elias finally said, voice low and steady. "You're safe for now, but we need to plan carefully. They'll be back, and next time they might not be so easy to mislead." The stranger nodded, trembling. "Thank you, I don't know what I would have done without you." There was sincerity in his voice, a mixture of gratitude and fear. Elias did not respond, his mind already racing ahead. He knew that this was only the beginning. The presence of the riders, the desperation of the stranger, and the dangers of the land meant that the quiet life he had known was over, for now. Every decision, every move would carry weight, and he would have to be smarter, faster, and braver than ever before. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the ranch, Elias and the stranger settled into an uneasy silence. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faint scent of dust and wildflowers. Somewhere in the distance, the hooves of horses echoed faintly, a reminder that the world beyond the ranch was still dangerous, still alive with threats. Elias McGraw knew one thing for certain. The simple, peaceful life he had cherished for so long was gone. The stranger's presence had changed everything, and the events of that day had set in motion a chain of choices, fears, and decisions that would test both men in ways they could not yet imagine. The Wild West was a place where survival often required courage, quick thinking, and sometimes actions that could haunt a man forever. And Elias McGraw was about to learn that lesson more vividly than ever. The night after the riders had fled, the ranch was quiet, but the silence felt heavy. Elias McGraw sat on the porch, his elbows resting on his knees, eyes scanning the dark horizon. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint scent of dust and dry grass. The events of the day weighed heavily on him. He had managed to protect the stranger, but he knew that the danger was far from over. Every sound, every shadow, seemed like it could hide trouble. The Wild West was not forgiving, and he was learning that lesson the hard way. Inside the cabin, the stranger remained in the cellar, unable to sleep. Fear had replaced exhaustion now, leaving him restless and jittery. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind against the cabin walls made him flinch. He had escaped the immediate threat, but the reality of what could happen next kept his mind racing. He had no plan, no allies, and nowhere else to go. The only person he could rely on was Elias, a man who had shown him kindness but whose trust he knew he could easily break. By morning, the stranger approached Elias cautiously. "I don't want to cause you trouble," he said, his voice low and shaky. "I didn't ask for any of this. I was running, trying to survive." His eyes were filled with a mix of guilt and fear. Elias looked at him carefully, studying every line of his face, every tremor in his hands. "I know you're scared," he said quietly, "but fear isn't always your enemy. It can guide you, help you make the right choices. The question is, are you willing to do what's necessary to survive?" The stranger swallowed hard. I think so. I just don't know if I can." Elias nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his own thoughts pressing down on him. He knew that the days ahead would require more than courage. They would demand moral clarity, judgment, and sometimes actions that could haunt a man for the rest of his life. He also knew that the stranger was counting on him, and that responsibility was not one he could take lightly. The morning passed in tense silence. Elias went about his work, tending the cattle and repairing fences, while keeping a watchful eye on the horizon. The stranger stayed close to the cabin, his presence a constant reminder of the fragile balance between safety and danger. Neither man spoke much, but both understood the unspoken truth. The events of the previous day had changed everything. The quiet rhythm of ranch life had been broken, replaced by uncertainty and fear. By afternoon, Elias decided it was time to confront the reality of their situation. "We need to talk," he said, motioning for the stranger to sit on a nearby log. "You can't stay hidden forever. Those men will come back, and when they do, they won't be as easy to trick. We have to be prepared for that." The stranger nodded, his hands clenching together nervously. "I don't even know who they are," he admitted. "I can't explain why they're after me. I ran, and now I'm here." Elias studied him carefully. The man's fear seemed genuine, but there was also something else, an unease that hinted at hidden truths. "You have to understand," Elias said, his voice firm but calm, "in this world, intentions don't always matter. What matters is survival, and sometimes survival requires making choices you'll regret. Are you ready for that?" The stranger looked down at the ground, wrestling with the question. I don't know," he whispered. "I want to survive, but I don't want to hurt anyone else. I don't want to do something I can't take back." Elias nodded, understanding all too well. "That's the hardest part," he said. "Every man in this land faces that choice. You can try to do the right thing, but sometimes the right thing and survival don't match. That's when you have to decide what matters most." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and carrying the faint sound of distant hooves. Both men froze, listening. It was a reminder that the danger had not disappeared, only retreated. Elias knew they had little time to prepare, and the decisions he made now would have consequences that neither of them could fully predict. He led the stranger into the cabin, speaking quietly so that the conversation wouldn't be overheard. "We need a plan," he said. "We can't just wait here and hope they don't come back. If they do, we'll be ready. But that means you need to trust me, and you need to follow my instructions exactly. No mistakes." The stranger nodded, swallowing hard. "I trust you," he said, though his voice wavered. "I don't have any other choice." Elias knew that trust was fragile, and that one wrong move could spell disaster for both of them. But he also knew that the man's survival depended on his own judgment, and that he couldn't let fear paralyze him. "Good," Elias said. "Then listen carefully. We're going to secure the cabin, make sure there are no blind spots, and set up a few distractions in case they come looking. You'll stay hidden, and I'll handle anything that comes toward us." The stranger followed instructions without question, his fear evident but his determination growing. Together, they worked in tense silence, preparing for the worst while hoping that the Wild West would offer them some measure of mercy. Hours passed, and Elias found himself reflecting on the events that had brought them here. He remembered the countless times he had faced danger in his life, the storms that threatened his cattle, the wild animals that prowled the plains, the men who had tried to cheat or harm him. He had always relied on his own strength, his own judgment, and his own experience. But this was different. This was a human life, fragile and desperate, and the stakes were higher than anything he had faced before. As evening approached, the tension in the cabin grew. The stranger sat quietly in the corner, glancing nervously at every shadow, every flicker of movement outside. Elias could see the fear etched into his face, but he could also see something else: resolve. Despite the terror, the man was beginning to understand the reality of their situation, and that understanding was beginning to shape his actions. Then, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the ranch was bathed in the orange glow of twilight, a sound carried through the air. A faint, almost imperceptible rustling, followed by a soft whistle. Elias froze, recognizing the signs immediately. The riders had returned. They were closer now, moving cautiously, testing the land, searching for any sign of the man they were hunting. Elias' heart raced, but he forced himself to remain calm. He knew that panic would only make things worse. He glanced at the stranger, who looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. Elias placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Stay calm," he whispered. "Do exactly what I say. No sudden moves, trust me." The riders drew closer, and Elias moved quickly but carefully. He set small traps and distractions, arranging objects and leaving subtle signs to mislead the men. Every step was calculated, every decision weighed with precision. The tension was unbearable, each moment stretching longer than the last. Inside the cabin, the stranger crouched in the cellar, listening to every sound, every movement outside. He could hear the soft crunch of boots, the faint whisper of voices, the rustle of leaves. Fear gripped him, but he remembered Elias' instructions and forced himself to remain still, silent, and unseen. Hours passed like this, the night stretching endlessly. Elias continued his watch, his mind sharp, his senses alert. He knew that the choices he made now would determine not only the stranger's survival, but also his own. He had faced danger before, but never with so much at stake, never with a human life dependent entirely on his judgment. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the riders began to retreat, their frustration evident in the distant shouts and the fading sound of hooves. Elias waited, ensuring they had gone far enough before allowing himself a small sigh of relief. The immediate danger had passed, but the night had shown him just how fragile life could be and how quickly circumstances could change. He returned to the cabin, his face grim but determined. The stranger emerged from the cellar, pale and shaken, but alive. Relief washed over both men, though neither spoke immediately. Words were unnecessary, the shared experience had conveyed everything. "You did well," Elias said finally, his voice low but steady. "You followed instructions. You stayed calm. That kept you alive." The stranger nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. I don't know how to thank you, he whispered. You saved my life. Elias shook his head. This isn't about thanks, he said. It's about surviving. Out here, every choice matters. Every action carries weight. You've learned that tonight, and I hope you'll remember it. The wind whispered through the trees outside, carrying the faint scent of dust and grass. The night was calm now, but both men knew that the peace was temporary. The Wild West was a place of constant danger, and their journey was far from over. Elias McGraw understood one thing clearly. Life out here demanded courage, judgment, and sometimes the willingness to make choices that could haunt a man forever. And the stranger, for the first time, was beginning to understand that truth as well. The next morning broke quietly over Elias McGraw's ranch, the sky painted with pale oranges and soft blues. The air was still, almost unnaturally calm, and for a moment it seemed as though the world had forgotten the chaos of the night before. Elias sat on the porch, his gaze sweeping over the fields and hills, but the sense of unease lingered like a shadow he could not shake. Something inside him told him that today would be different, that the choices he made in the coming hours could not be undone. Inside the cabin, the stranger had been restless all night. He had barely slept, haunted by the thought that the riders could return at any moment. Every creak of the floor, every rustle of the wind made him flinch. He had come to trust Elias, yet he still feared the consequences of being here. Survival, he realized, required more than simply hiding. It required decisions, and sometimes decisions no man wanted to make. By mid-morning, a distant sound reached their ears. At first it was faint, a soft crunch of boots against gravel, the low thrum of hooves, but it grew steadily louder. Elias stiffened, recognition flashing in his eyes. The riders were back, closer this time, and their movements were deliberate. They were not here by chance. They had tracked the man, and they would not leave without him. Elias turned to the stranger, his face grave. "They're close," he said. "We don't have much time. You need to stay hidden, and you need to stay quiet. I'll do everything I can, but I need you to trust me completely. No mistakes." The stranger nodded, swallowing hard. "I trust you," he whispered, though the fear in his voice betrayed him. "But I don't know what to do if they find me." Elias' jaw tightened. He had been thinking about that all night. The reality of their situation pressed down on him like the weight of the sun beating down on the open plains. These riders were not ordinary men. They were relentless, determined, and dangerous. If they found the stranger, it could mean death, either for the man or for Elias himself. And now, Elias understood that the final decision might not be about survival alone. It might require action that no one could foresee, no one could forgive easily. He led the stranger toward the back of the cabin, where the small cellar provided a temporary refuge. "Go down there," Elias said firmly. "Stay quiet. Do exactly what I say. I'll signal you when it's safe." The man hesitated, glancing at Elias with wide, fearful eyes. "Elias, what if they catch us?" Elias placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Then we deal with it. But if you stay calm and trust me, we have a chance. Now go." The stranger moved quickly, descending into the shadowed cellar, leaving Elias alone in the cabin. He could hear the distant hooves, the murmur of voices, and the faint clink of metal. His pulse pounded in his ears, a relentless drumbeat that mirrored the tension building inside him. This was the moment when instinct and judgment collided, when a single choice could change the course of both their lives forever. Elias stepped outside, Rust waiting patiently nearby. He scanned the horizon, calculating, planning. He knew the land intimately, the hidden gullies, the dense trees, the uneven terrain. He could use it to his advantage, to mislead the riders, to protect the stranger. But even with his knowledge, fear pressed against his chest. He was alone, facing men who would not hesitate to kill, and he had someone else's life in his hands. As the riders approached, Elias moved deliberately, keeping himself in view but staying alert. He noticed their leader, a tall man with a weathered hat and a sharp gaze, scanning the ground as if searching for a trace. Elias calculated each step, each movement, creating diversions with careful throws of rocks, with subtle tracks leading away from the cabin. Every moment was a delicate balance of courage and deception. Hours seemed to stretch endlessly. Elias' mind raced with possibilities. What if they split up? What if one of them guessed the hiding place? What if the stranger panicked? Every scenario carried weight. Every outcome was dangerous. And then, in a moment of silence, he realized that the unthinkable choice loomed before him, one that he could not delay any longer. The riders were growing closer, more insistent, and Elias could see that their patience was wearing thin. He had created distractions, misled them with false trails, but he could not hold them off forever. The cabin, the stranger, and the life within it were all vulnerable. He had a choice to make, an action that would ensure survival but would carry consequences heavier than any physical labor, heavier than any danger he had faced before. Elias' mind went back to the stranger, alone and terrified in the cellar. He thought of the man's pleading eyes, of his desperation, and he knew what he had to do. Fear and responsibility collided in a single, crushing moment. And then, with a deep breath, he made the choice. He acted quickly, deliberately. Every movement was precise, every sound calculated. He created a final distraction, drawing the rider's attention toward him, and in the chaos, he ensured the stranger remained unseen. The unthinkable had been done, an action born of desperation, of fear, and of an unspoken understanding that sometimes survival required decisions that would haunt a man for the rest of his life. The riders reacted instantly, confusion spreading across their faces as Elias' diversion succeeded. He saw their leader curse under his breath, signaling the others to regroup. And in that moment, Elias felt a strange mixture of relief and horror. The immediate danger had passed, but the consequences of his choice settled over him like a heavy shroud. Back in the cellar, the stranger remained still, unaware of the precise nature of what had occurred, but sensing the tension and the intensity of the moment. He clutched the bundle he had carried, breathing shallowly, feeling the weight of fear and anticipation pressing down. He trusted Elias, but even in trust, he could feel the enormity of the events unfolding above him. Hours passed in tense silence. The riders eventually retreated, frustrated but unable to pinpoint the source of their frustration. Elias waited until the dust settled, until the quiet returned, and only then did he descend to the cellar. The stranger looked up as Elias entered, eyes wide with relief and lingering fear. "Are they gone?" he asked, his voice trembling. Elias nodded slowly, his face grave. "For now," he said, "but we can't be certain. Out here, danger doesn't disappear, it only moves. You need to understand that life is fragile, and survival sometimes demands actions no one wants to take, actions you might regret forever." The stranger swallowed hard, trembling. I don't know what you mean," he whispered. Elias looked at him, the weight of exhaustion and responsibility in his eyes. "Today, we survived. But surviving wasn't just about hiding. It required choices, choices that are never easy, choices that can change a man forever. And you need to remember, every moment out here, every decision carries weight. Life isn't fair, and the Wild West doesn't forgive hesitation." The stranger nodded, understanding dawning slowly. "I understand," he said quietly. "But what did you do?" Elias shook his head, refusing to speak the details. Some things could not be explained. Some actions were meant to protect, to save, and the reasoning behind them could only be carried silently, as a burden. He wanted the stranger to survive, and in that moment that was all that mattered. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the ranch. The air was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of dust and wild grass. The events of the day had left both men exhausted but alive. Elias knew that the immediate danger had passed, but the tension remained. The Wild West had tested them, pushed them to the edge, and revealed truths about fear, morality, and survival that neither man could ignore. Elias stood on the porch, looking out over the fields, and felt the weight of what had occurred settle over him. He had made the unthinkable choice, an action born of desperation and courage, and now he had to live with it. He knew that the stranger's life was safe, but the consequences of that choice would ripple through their lives in ways neither could yet predict. The stranger emerged from the cellar later, quiet and pale, but alive. The relief was tangible, but so was the understanding that their journey was far from over. The Wild West was unpredictable, unforgiving, and dangerous, and both men had been reminded that survival was never simple. It demanded courage, judgment, and sometimes the willingness to make choices no one wanted to make. Elias McGraw knew, deep down, that this day would stay with him forever. The unthinkable had been done, the moral line crossed, and the consequences would haunt him. But in the harsh reality of the Wild West, survival often required exactly that, a choice made in a moment, with life hanging in the balance and no certainty of forgiveness or understanding. The morning after the unthinkable choice, the ranch was quieter than usual. A soft mist lingered over the fields, giving the land an almost surreal feeling, as though the events of the past days had shifted the world slightly out of place. Elias McGraw moved slowly, each step deliberate, his mind heavy with the weight of his actions. He had survived, the stranger had survived, but the consequences of what had happened yesterday pressed on him like a shadow that would not lift. Inside the cabin, the stranger was awake early, still pale and shaken, though his eyes carried a spark of something new, awareness, understanding, and perhaps a fragile sense of trust. He had seen Elias act in ways he could not yet comprehend fully, choices that were terrifying and yet necessary. His heart still pounded when he remembered the hooves, the shouting, and the tension that had gripped them both. But he also knew that without Elias' quick thinking and courage, he would not be here at all. Elias prepared a simple breakfast, moving quietly but with purpose. The smell of coffee and toasted bread filled the cabin, offering a sense of normalcy that contrasted sharply with the fear and chaos of the previous day. The stranger watched him silently, unsure whether to speak or remain quiet. Finally, he found his voice. "Elias, I don't know how to say this, but thank you. I'm alive because of you." Elias nodded, his expression serious. "Don't thank me yet. The world out here doesn't forgive mistakes and danger doesn't disappear. But for now, you survived. That is what matters." The stranger looked down, a mixture of relief and guilt crossing his face. I never expected life to be like this. I thought running would be enough. I didn't think that survival would ask so much from someone else." Elias' eyes softened slightly, though his voice remained firm. "That's the way it works. Survival isn't simple. It never is. Sometimes it asks for more than courage. Sometimes it asks for judgment, for decisions that are impossible, and for sacrifices you cannot explain. That is life in the Wild West." For the next few hours, the two men worked in silence, tending to the ranch, checking the fences, and making sure the cattle were safe. Elias moved with calm efficiency, but every action was accompanied by a weight in his chest, a reminder of the choices he had made and the responsibility he carried. The stranger tried to help where he could, though his hands trembled slightly, a visible reflection of the fear still lingering inside him. As the day progressed, Elias began to talk more, sharing his thoughts quietly. "You need to understand something," he said, glancing at the stranger as he hammered a fence post into place. "Out here, life doesn't wait for anyone, danger doesn't knock politely, and the choices you make can follow you forever. What you do today, what you choose when faced with fear, it shapes you." The stranger listened intently, his mind trying to absorb the weight of the words. "I understand," he said finally, "but I don't know if I could do what you did. I don't know if I could face that moment and make the choice you made." Elias stopped and looked out over the fields, his eyes distant. "I didn't want to do it. I froze at first just like anyone would. Fear is natural. But when survival and responsibility collide, hesitation can be deadly. Sometimes you don't have the luxury to think. You act, and you live with the consequences." The stranger nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "So what happens now?" he asked, uncertainty in his voice. Elias considered the question carefully. "Now we survive. We stay alert. We learn from what happened. Out here, every day is a test and every choice matters. The danger may have passed for now, but it's always out there. You have to be ready." The afternoon sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the ranch. Elias worked steadily, but his mind wandered to the events of the past days, the fear, the choices, and the responsibility he had carried. He realized that the Wild West was not just about survival against nature or outlaws. It was about the constant struggle between morality and necessity, between fear and action. Every man faced these challenges in some form, and every choice left a mark. Later in the day, the stranger approached Elias, his expression hesitant but determined. "Elias, I want to learn. I want to understand what it takes to survive out here. I don't want to be helpless again." Elias looked at him carefully. There was courage in his eyes, a determination that was born not of recklessness but of understanding. "Good," Elias said finally. "Then listen. Survival is not just about strength or skill. It's about knowing the land, reading people, understanding danger, and making decisions even when fear is screaming at you. And sometimes, it's about making choices you'll never forget, but that are necessary." The stranger nodded, absorbing the words like a lesson that was hard-earned and precious. He began to help more actively, following Elias' instructions carefully, learning how to move through the fields quietly, how to watch the horizon, and how to think several steps ahead. The bond between them grew stronger, forged in the crucible of fear, trust, and shared experience. As evening approached, Elias and the stranger sat on the porch, looking out over the fields as the sun dipped toward the horizon. The air was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and dry grass. For a moment there was a sense of peace, though both men knew it was temporary. The Wild West was unpredictable, and danger could return at any moment. Elias broke the silence. "I want you to understand something," he said quietly. "What we went through, it changes a man. It changes you whether you like it or not. You carry it with you and it becomes part of who you are. The fear, the choices, the responsibility, it doesn't go away. But it can make you stronger. It can teach you to survive and to understand what really matters." The stranger nodded slowly. "I think I understand," he said. "I don't know if I could have done what you did, but I hope I can learn to be brave, to make the right choices when it matters." Elias smiled faintly, a rare softness in his expression. "You will," he said. "It takes time, it takes experience. And it takes the courage to face yourself, even when you're afraid." Night fell over the ranch, and the stars appeared one by one, twinkling in the clear, dark sky. The world was vast and untamed, and both men felt the weight of it pressing down, but also the beauty of it lifting their spirits. They had survived, they had made it through the danger, and they had learned something valuable about trust, courage, and responsibility. As the stranger settled in for the night, he looked out the window at the endless fields, feeling a sense of gratitude and humility. He had come to the ranch as a man running from fear and danger, and now he was learning to face both with understanding and courage. He knew that the path ahead would not be easy, that the Wild West would continue to test him, but he also knew that he was not alone. Elias sat on the porch for a long time, reflecting on everything that had happened. The unthinkable choice, the fear, the responsibility, it all weighed on him, but it had also reaffirmed something he had always known. Survival in the Wild West was not just about strength or skill, but about courage, judgment, and the willingness to act when it mattered most. And sometimes the hardest choices were the ones that defined a man. By the next morning, life on the ranch returned to a fragile sense of routine. The cattle grazed, the fences were checked, and the fields seemed calm. But both men knew that peace was never permanent. Danger could return at any time, and survival required constant vigilance. Yet, they also knew that they had faced it together, and that experience had changed them. They were stronger, wiser, and more aware of the delicate balance between fear, action, and morality. As the sun rose higher, casting light across the hills, Elias and the stranger stood side by side, looking out over the land. They had survived the ordeal, learned lessons about courage and responsibility, and come to understand the harsh, unforgiving reality of the Wild West. And while the future remained uncertain, they faced it with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that they had the strength and judgment to endure whatever challenges lay ahead. In the quiet of the morning, Elias McGraw realized that life in the Wild West demanded more than strength. It demanded choices, courage, and the willingness to bear the weight of those choices, no matter the cost. And as he looked at the stranger, no longer just a frightened man, but someone learning to face the world with understanding and bravery, he felt a quiet hope. Survival was not easy, but it was possible, and in that truth lay a fragile, enduring peace. The day stretched before them, full of work, life, and the ever-present possibility of danger. But for now they were alive, they were together, and they had learned the most important lesson of all. In a world as harsh and unpredictable as the Wild West, courage and morality were inseparable, and survival depended on knowing when to act, when to trust, and when to face the unthinkable.